Encourage you to be taking out your Bibles and following along this morning to test the things I have to say, to see that they be by God's Word. Hope that we'll find them to be the truth, we'll take and apply in our everyday walks of life, and we can leave here being better servants of God in the future than we've been in the past. A little bit of change of plans concerning our series. As you all know, it's been a very... We're going to take a break today from our series on divorce and remarriage, and we'll finish that series up next week in answering those questions that were submitted. We had quite a few questions submitted, and I want to be able to spend a full work week working on those to make sure we answer those as thoroughly and clearly as possible. Because this is such an important topic, we don't want to be want anything to be misunderstood, and want to make sure that we know what the truth is concerning the subject of divorce and remarriage. And so we're going to take a break today, but we'll finish that series up next week. Hebrews that Trenton just read for us is the beginning of what we often refer to as that great hall of faith. A list of characters, great men and women, who exemplified faith in their lives. And as you read through this list, and you think about this list, we often go here and talk about the importance of faith. Here are some individuals who believed in God, who exemplified a true faith. You know, the need for faith is not something that is disputed in the religious world. You can go to any religious body that believes in the God of the Bible and believes in Jesus Christ, and you're going to hear something about the importance of belief. It doesn't matter what else they believe. It doesn't matter how much what they believe differs. What you're going to hear is going to boil down to this. It's essential you believe. But you know, the question is often raised, and it's often discussed about the fact that man, and many want to argue that man is justified by faith only. There's no need for any works. There's no need for any works. There's no need for man to do anything. Man's justified by faith only. Well, if you have it, turn to Hebrews chapter 11 and put a marker there. We're going to look at some things in Hebrews chapter 11. I want to suggest to you this morning, as we discuss the importance of faith, that man indeed is justified by faith. As we discuss the importance of faith, that man indeed is justified by faith only when his faith acts in a certain way. You know, many want to argue that man is justified by his faith only, but man is justified by his faith only when it's possible to have faith, beloved, that are necessary, that we're justified by our faith only when we possess these certain characteristics. Here's number one. Man is justified by his faith only when we worship God acceptably. In Hebrews chapter 11 and in verse 4, Abel offered to God a better sacrifice than Cain, through which he was approved as being righteous, God approving his gifts, and through faith, though he is dead, he still speaks. You know, in the text here in Hebrews chapter 11, the first character we're introduced is we're talking about Abel and how he offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain. And I want you to think for just a second about these two sacrifices, the sacrifice of Abel and the sacrifice of Cain, and what's distinct and different about the two. Go for just a second to Genesis chapter 4. Genesis chapter 4. This is the text. This is the text in which the sacrifice takes place. It tells us that it happened in verse 3, that in the course of time, that Cain brought an offering to the Lord of the fruit of the ground. In the course of time, that Cain brought an offering to the Lord of the fruit of the ground. And Abel on his part also brought of the firstborns of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and for his offering he had no regard. So as you look at this text here, what's different? Well, the way that it's often viewed is that they need to have faith. And I want you to see here in this text, both had faith or believed in God. Why else would Cain offer to God a sacrifice that Cain offered to the Lord? and Abel offered to the Lord. Both believed that God exists. Both believed they needed to worship God. So both believed He existed, both believed He needed to worship God. But something still sets apart the offering of Abel from the offering of Cain. Still sets apart the offering of Abel from the offering of Cain. Look again, think again about Hebrews chapter 11. By faith Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain. The difference is faith. The difference is Abel's sacrifice was offered by faith and Cain's was not. Well, what does it mean it's offered by faith? Because as we already saw, they both believe in God. One of the first memory verses most of us learned was Romans chapter 10 and in verse 17. So then faith comes by hearing. Genuine faith, because they've heard the Word of God, they believe the Word of God. So you see, when Abel offered a sacrifice by faith, his sacrifice is by faith because he followed God's command. What was that command? We don't know. Because no specifics are given to us in Genesis chapter 4. But I know this. If God was pleased with Abel's and not with Cain's, and Abel's was by faith, then Cain's had to not be by faith, which means one obeyed God's command and the other didn't. Otherwise, if they offered what they thought was best and God accepted one and not the other, God is a respecter of persons. But Abel offered by faith. He followed the instructions that he was given. Cain did not. And Cain's worship, not being by faith, Cain's worship, not following the commands of God, had a very different outcome than Abel's. Because Abel was commended as righteous. Hebrews 11 and then verse 4. Having offered a better sacrifice, he was approved or commended as righteous, God approving his gifts. Not only in Hebrews 11 and in verse 4 was Abel's sacrifice more pleasing to God than the sacrifice of Cain, God approved him as righteous. God commended him as righteous. This isn't man saying, you know that Abel, he's a very righteous individual. It's God that said that. God approved of his gifts. And so God accepted his sacrifice, yet for Cain's he had no regard. And you know the rest of the story. Cain eventually became jealous. He killed his brother and eventually became a vagabond upon the face of the earth. So Abel was justified by faith and is in Hebrews 11 because he served God acceptably. We see, we are commanded today to offer to God acceptable worship. Hebrews 12, 28 and 29. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot with reverence and godly fear. So he tells us in Hebrews chapter 12 that we must worship God acceptably. That tells me first and foremost, there's a such thing as unacceptable worship. There's a way one could worship in which their worship not be pleasing in the eyes of God. So we need acceptable worship, which means we offer worship by faith. Which means we follow the command of God. Remember John 4:20 and 24. We talked last week about 7 months. This was the first must we talked about. That God is spirit and those who worship Him must worship in spirit and in truth. Must worship in spirit and in truth. They must possess the right attitude and they must do the right things. There are 2 components of worship. And we must worship in spirit and in truth. We must possess the right kind of attitude. Not the attitude that views worship as a weariness and a dread, as the people of Malachi's day did. But instead we possess the attitude of the psalmist, who said, I was glad when they said unto me, let us go into the house of the Lord. And then it means we follow the command of God. And whatever you do, Colossians 3:17, in word or in deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through Him. And so we do it by the authority that we find in the Scriptures. We do it with the right attitude so we can offer acceptable worship. And then we can be justified by our faith. But only when we we worship God acceptably. Now, go back to Hebrews chapter 11. Let's look at a second thing we have to do if we want to be pleasing to God. We're justified by our faith only when we walk with God. Hebrews 11, so that he would not see death. And he was not found because God took him. For prior to being taken, he was approved as pleasing to God. But Genesis' account of the life of Enoch said that Enoch walked with God and was not, for God took him. The reason Enoch was not, the reason God took him is 5:22 through 24. And so Enoch was justified by his faith because here's a man that walked with God. You see, often we think about him as being one of two men. Enoch is one of two men never to die. If you ask somebody, what do you know about Enoch? There's not a whole lot said about him in the Scriptures. If you ask somebody, what do you know about Enoch? There's not a whole lot said about him in the Scriptures. He's mentioned here in Hebrews. He's mentioned, I believe, in the book of Jude in one verse, and he's mentioned in Genesis in like 3 or 4 verses. And that's the extent of what we have recorded about him. And if you say, what do you know about Enoch? Most people are probably going to say, he, along with Elijah, was by God. That's what we generally know him for. But what we need to remember him more for is for his walk with God. We need to remember him for his walk with God. The reason he was not where God took him is because he walked with God. Genesis 5. Because he walked with God. Genesis 5, 22 to 24. Enoch walked with God and he was not. Verse 24, that should be, for God took him. You see, in order for one to be pleasing to God, they need to walk with God. They need to do the things that God has prescribed in his will. He's a man who walked with God, and so God took him and he did not see death. And you and I today, if we want to have faith that justifies, if we want to be justified by our faith, we need to have a faith that causes us to walk with God. But how do we do that? How do we do this? How do we walk with God? Look quickly with me at Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5. I think no passage better illustrates what it means to walk with God than Ephesians chapter 5. We'll hit rather quickly here. Ephesians 5, 1 through 21. Ephesians 5, 1 through 21, you could outline this way: be imitators of God. This way, be imitators of God. Ephesians 5, 1 through 21 is be imitators of God. But here's what is said in that text. It tells us to be an imitator of God. Number one, you've got to walk in love. Look at verse 2. He told us, verse 1, to be imitators and walk in love, verse 2. Just as Christ also had a sacrifice to God as a fragrant aroma. You want to be pleasing to God? You need to walk in love. You need to possess the love of Christ, that sacrificial love. He gave himself for you. Will you show that sacrificial love to others? You want to be pleasing and walk with God? You've got to walk in that love of Christ. Possess. You want to walk with God? Here's the second thing he tells us in Ephesians 5. You've got to walk as children of light. He told them in verse 3 about the things that they should not be doing and those that would not be saved. The sexually immoral, the impure, the greedy. Don't let it be named among you, he said. Nor the filthiness or foolish talk. Don't let it be named among you, he said. Nor the filthiness or foolish talk or coarse jesting, which are not fitting, but rather the giving of thanks. You see, you don't do all these bad things, but rather you give thanks. For this you know with certainty. That is, you know this is to be absolutely or impure or greedy, who is an idolater, has an inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. Those that walk in sin, those will not inherit the kingdom of heaven. So don't be deceived, he tells them in verse 6. And don't partake with those who deceive, and don't partake with those who deceive, and those who will have the wrath of God upon them. Because you once, verse 8, you were formerly darkness. You previously were part of this world, but now you are light in the Lord, verse 8, walk as children of light. Now he's just told us, walk as children of light. Now he's just told us what the first part of that entails. The first part of walking as children of light is walking different than the world walks. Ephesians 4 dealt with that as well, with not being like the world. Somebody says, I want to walk with God, but I don't know how to do that. Well, first and foremost, it requires you not living like the world around you. Remember, we're called upon to be holy. The Lord said, "Be holy, for I am holy." Holy requires us to be set apart, to be sanctified, and to be different. And if we're walking like the world walks, and we're not walking with God, because the majority is lost. And so we need to walk as children of light by putting away these former things. But instead, verse 8, for the fruit of the light consists in all goodness and righteousness and truth. You have the fruit of light. You try to learn what is pleasing to the Lord, verse 10. And instead don't participate in those works of darkness. So it comes back because you don't do those again. But look at verse 9 and 11. The fruit of the light consists in all goodness and righteousness and truth. Instead you bear the fruit of the light, and you learn what is pleasing to the Lord, and that is what you is pleasing to God. As you put off that old man, as you're no longer walking as the world does, but walking as a child of light who's trying to learn and do what is pleasing in the eyes of the Lord. And then now, verse 15, you walk circumspectly. Or I believe it's the New American Standard that says, look carefully how you walk. The New American Standard and Legacy Standard translations say. Not as unwise, but as wise. You don't need to walk with wisdom. You don't need to just walk blindly. You don't need to walk as everybody else does, but you walk with wisdom. Two main things. This goes down to take away from this. When you're walking wisely, you first and foremost, you make the best use of your time. Verse 16. Verse 16. Redeeming the time because the days are evil. The English Standard Version says, making the best use of your time. We need to learn how to use our time wisely in order to avoid being drawn and pulled into sin. Now, I'm not talking about using our time wisely as in we're doing something that's not unrighteous versus doing sin. Doing something that's not unrighteous versus doing sin. That's what I think sometimes we confuse knowledge and wisdom. Here's what knowledge is. Sexual immorality is a sin. That's knowledge. We all know that. Sexual immorality is a sin. That we have knowledge in knowing that's the truth. And so, the temptation is there to sexual immorality, you avoid that. How can you avoid that? Well, I know that's wrong. But now wisdom comes in learning how to handle situations where right or wrong may not necessarily be at stake. Here's what I mean by that. There are times we could choose something that is not inherently sinful, but if it pulls away from our time and service to God, that's not making the best use of our time. It's not wrong in and of itself, but if it begins to pull away, then we're starting to not redeem the time. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, talk about let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, setting aside the sin and the weight which so easily ensnares us. We know what the sin is. That's just anything that's a violation of God's law. But the weights of Hebrews 12 are the things that are not wrong in and of themselves. And there's many things that we could do that become a stumbling block. How do we avoid that? We make the best use of our time. And make sure we're spending our time for the best, to equip ourselves to be the best servants of God we can be, because the days are evil. And then you also need to know what the will of the Lord is, verse 17. On account of this, do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. Here's something very important for us to learn. We can and we must know what the will of the Lord is, and understand what the will of the Lord is. Oftentimes you'll hear that the Bible is too difficult to understand. It's so difficult to understand passages. And there are passages that are difficult to understand. Don't get me wrong. Passages are difficult to understand. Don't get me wrong. Passages like the book of Revelation and the latter half of Daniel and some of the visions of Ezekiel, there's some difficult passages of Scripture. But what you need for your soul's salvation is simple to understand. And we need to understand what that will in our everyday walks of life. And it's not a suggestion that is made, but a command that is given. Look again at verse 17 of Ephesians chapter 5. On account of this, do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. And what the will of the Lord is. If it's a command of God, then it's something we can do, because He's not going to tie on us more than we can bear. And so we must understand what the will of the Lord is. And then, if we do all of that, we are walking with God. If we walk in love, if we walk in light, if we walk as wise and looking carefully how we walk, then we're walking with God and we're justified by our faith. Tell you a third thing. Hebrews 11 points out we need to be justified by our faith. We're justified by our faith when that faith causes us to be moved with godly fear. Look at Hebrews 11 and in verse 7. By faith Noah, being warned about things not yet seen, in reverence or in fear, prepared an ark for the salvation of his household. You see, God tells Noah what he needs to do, and that wasn't enough. Noah had to listen to what God said and follow that. And he did because he had a reverence for God. He had a reverence for God, and so he followed what God said. He found favor in the eyes of the Lord in verse 8 of Genesis 6, and so he did according to all that God commanded him, because of the reverence and respect he had for God. Reverence and respect he had for God. I want you to understand something about the reverence and respect he had for God. He believed what God said and was willing to follow it, even though it didn't really make sense. There's some debate if it had ever rained, whether it ever rained before the flood or not, but I can tell you this. It never rained like that before. It never rained like that before, for 40 days and 40 nights, where the fountains of the deep were opened up and the tops of the hills were covered. It had never rained like that before. And you think about the people, it had never rained like that before. And you think about the people that went by and mocked Noah as he's building this really big boat for this really big rainstorm that's supposed to come, that hasn't come from the time he's told to the time it finally comes, 120 years. He has a reverence and a respect for God, and that godly fear caused him to be moved to the point that he built that ark. He obeyed the command of God. And because of that, he and his household were saved. We see, you and I must possess godly fear or reverence towards God. Or reverence towards God. In 1 Timothy chapter 4 and in verse 7, Paul told Timothy to refuse godless myths fit only for old women, and on the other hand, train yourself for the purpose of godliness, or exercise yourself to godliness. In 2 Peter 3:11, Peter was talking about the judgment day, and how with certainty the judgment day would come. And he talks about the fact that because the Lord said it would, we can have certainty in that. And he alludes back to Noah and the flood, and how the Lord promised that a flood would come, and a flood did come. And after he finishes all that, he tells them in verse 10 that the dead will pass away, both the earth and the works therein will be burned up. Since all these things are to be destroyed, verse 11 of 2 Peter 3. Since all these things are to be destroyed in this way, what sort of people ought you to be in holy conduct and godliness? That's reverence. Godliness is reverence. Exercise or discipline himself towards it. Peter said it was essential for living the life in light of the second coming. And in 2 Peter 1, and what we refer to as the Christian graces, it's part of the Christian who grows. Now, for this very reason also, applying all diligence, in your faith, supply moral excellence. And in your faith, supply moral excellence. And in your moral excellence, knowledge. And in your knowledge, self-control. And in your self-control, perseverance. And in your perseverance, godliness. And in your godliness, brotherly kindness. And in your brotherly kindness, love. Alongside love and faith and moral excellence and knowledge and reverence and respect for God. And we need to possess this reverence and respect toward God. Vincent said this word means to have a God-word attitude. And so, do we show reverence and respect to God in the way that we conduct ourselves in our lives? Because if we do, that's good. Because we can be justified by our faith. Because if we do, that's good. Because we can be justified by our faith. But if we do not show reverence and respect to God, then we're not justified by our faith. Because we're justified by our faith only when we have reverence and respect for God. Two more points and the lesson will be yours this morning. We're justified. Hebrews 11, 8 through 17. I want you to think about this story here in Abraham. Hebrews chapter 11 talks about Abraham, how he was called. When he was called, he obeyed, verse 8, by going out. By faith, when he was tested, in verse 17, he offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was offering up his only son. You see, Abraham obeyed God. Two occasions listed here in Hebrews 11. He obeyed God first and foremost when he left Ur of the Chaldees. Now, when we're introduced to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, he's already outlived Haran. He's halfway through the trip. But we know from Acts chapter 7 and Stephen's recalling of the events that he was called out of Ur. Now, I want you to think about, just a second, the fact that he has left his hometown, the place he's only ever known. This is where he's grown up, and he leaves it. Not only does he leave it, he leaves it without knowing where he is going. I don't know about you, but moving is not the most exciting thing to do. You should know, I just did it. I've done it twice in the last year and a half. But I tell you this, at least I knew where I was going both times. I knew where I was headed when I packed up that truck and I drove out here a couple months ago. Abraham, when he packs up his belongings and he gets ready to go, he doesn't know where he's going. He just knows he's going to a land that God has told him. Get up and go. Then it was time to get up and go. And so he obeyed when he left Ur of the Chaldees, the only home he'd ever known. And by the way, a city quite modern for that day and time. A well-advanced city, Ur of the Chaldees was. And Abraham left that behind. The plot of land he possessed was a burial plot. And other than that, he owned no land and dwelt in a tent. And he left it all behind because God told him to go to a land that he would show him. And he listened. But you know, he also obeyed when it came to offering up Isaac in Genesis chapter 22. As God obeyed when it came to offering up Isaac in Genesis chapter 22. As God tested or to prove Abraham and tells him to take and offer up his son, his only son, Isaac. He doesn't. He gets all the way there to the altar and is ready to kill his only son. To the altar and is ready to kill his only son. Because God said to. In fact, verse 19, considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he, figuratively speaking, he also received him. He had such deep-rooted faith in God that he not only obeyed the command to offer up Isaac and was ready to kill him, but he had such faith in God, he believed what God said about through Isaac his seed should be called. That if it takes God raising Isaac from the dead, then that's what God is going to do. By this time in Genesis, by the way, there have been no recorded accounts of resurrection from the dead. But Abraham believed God and was willing to obey, knowing that no matter what, God would keep his word. And it's worth following God. And so he follows his instruction, even to the point that he has the knife over his son to slay him. You see, well, he was somebody that obeyed and was justified by his faith. We too must obey God. The book of Romans is a book that is often referred to by those in the religious world to argue that we're justified by our faith only. Because by your faith in the first 11 chapters, right? We don't have a book that is often used to argue that we're justified by faith only. It teaches quite the opposite. Sort of as bookends, the first chapter and in the last chapter, as well as once in the middle, Paul, look at Romans chapter 1 and then verse 5. Romans chapter 1 and then verse 5. Through whom we receive grace and apostleship for the obedience of faith among all the Gentiles for the sake of his name. The obedience of faith for the sake of his name. The obedience of faith. Romans 16:26 says essentially the same thing, but is now manifested by the scriptures of the prophets according to the commandment of the eternal God, has made known to all the Gentiles, leading to obedience of faith. But I want you to go to Romans. Let's look at Romans chapter 6. Remember Romans chapter 5, set the context of where we are. Romans chapter 5, Paul made the point that where sin abounds, grace abounds much more. And because typically the way Paul wrote, he began chapter 6 by answering an argument before the way Paul wrote. He began chapter 6 by answering an argument before they actually raised the argument. He foresaw by inspiration wrote, foreseeing the problem that some might say, well, if grace abounds where sin abounds, let's sin so grace can abound. So he argues, can we sin that grace may abound? God forbid. How shall we that die? But he came to the end of that argument and said that sin is not a master over you, but you are not under law but under grace. Well, he foresaw another argument. Well, if we're not under law but under grace, can we sin now? Here's what he said. Verse 16. Do you not know that when you go on presenting yourselves to someone as slaves for obedience, you are slaves to the one whom you obey, either of sin leading to death or of obedience leading to righteousness? If you're obeying sin, you have the consequence of death. Or you have this obedience that leads to righteousness, but you're obeying something. You're either obeying the will of the world or you're obeying what God has said. You're obeying something. But thanks, verse 17, but thanks be to God that though you were slaves of sin, that as formerly obedient to sin, you obeyed from the heart the pattern of teaching to which you were given over. You once lived in that doctrine. You've obeyed the teachings that we have showed you, and now you follow. You live a life of obedience. Here's the fact that he gives in Romans chapter 6. Obedience is essential. You're either going to have to obey God and be righteous and have that reward in heaven, or you're going to be obeying sin and you're going to have to obey something. But it's only when you're obeying God that you're justified by your faith. Yes, man's justified by faith, as he points out in Romans. But only when that faith is active and obedient. So we're justified by our faith only when we worship God obediently. So we're justified by our faith only when we worship God acceptably, only when we walk with God, only when we have godly fear, only when we obey, and finally, only when we look to the city that has foundations. Hebrews 11. Or it should be Hebrews 11:10, right? The city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. See, Abraham is somebody that was not looking to a physical reward, but his eternal reward. Hebrews 11:13 beginning points out in more detail about that. How all these died. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all these died without having seen the promises, or receiving the promises, but they saw them afar off. He points out. And now here they are, having seen these promises afar off, and welcoming them from a distance, they confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. Well, Abraham left his home country. He's a stranger and an exile, right? He left his home country. He's living in a land where he has no relatives. He's a stranger. He's an exile. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about them being pilgrims on the earth, not pilgrims in a foreign land. Look again. They were strangers and exiles on the earth. For those who say such things, make it clear they are seeking a country of their own. And indeed, if they had been remembering that country from which they had went out, they would have had opportunity to return. So he makes it clear he's seeking a country of his own. Well, Abraham, if you're foreign and an exile, why don't you go back to earth? Well, that's not the country he's seeking. He says that if he had done that, he had opportunity to return, but now they aspire to a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, where he has prepared a city for them. You see, we need to be like that which was beyond. He was looking to his eternal reward. Why is it that Abraham obeyed to reach his soul? When it came to leaving and going to earth the Chaldees? Why is it Abraham obeyed when it came to offering up his only son Isaac? It's because he wasn't focused on the here and the now. He was looking to his eternal reward. He was looking to the city architect and builder is God. Well, you see, we too have no lasting city. And so we seek one that is to come. Same book, just a few chapters later, Hebrews chapter 13, verse 14. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 14. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 14. For here we do not have a lasting city, but we are seeking the one to come. See, Abraham wasn't focused on a city here. He was focused on the city that was, on being in heaven. He was focused on the city that is to come. And we, like Abraham, need to be focused on that reward. We, like Abraham, need to be focused more on spending eternity with God than on the things of the here and the now. If Abraham had been focused on the here and the now, he would have left the land of Canaan and he'd have gone back to Ur of the Chaldees, where he had relatives. He'd have gone back to Ur where he had a home to live in. He'd have gone back to Ur where he had a home to live in. He'd have gone back to Ur where he had a more modern city and modern things than where he was. But instead, he dwelt in a foreign land and he dwelt in a tent because he knew that not only was he a sojourner there, he was a sojourner here on earth as a whole. He was a sojourner here on earth as a whole. And we too are pilgrims, as is pointed out in the book of 1 Peter. And we need to live as such. As the song we sometimes sing, this world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. And if you are faith, but only when we focus on the reward and not the here and the now. We're justified by our faith, but only when that faith worships God acceptably. Only when that faith causes us to walk with God, when it causes us to look to the city that has foundations, to look to the city that is beyond, the one to come, then, and only then, can we be justified by our faith. Well, maybe as we come to close the lesson this morning, if there's one of our present who may have never responded in obedience to the gospel. If you're here and you get to respond in obedience to the gospel, why do you wait? Because you're not guaranteed another opportunity. For what is our life but a vapor that appears for a short time and vanishes away? But if you're here and you believe that as you have faith in God and you have faith in Jesus Christ, then we not repent of your sins. Turn from to Him, no longer the slave of sin, but a slave of God. Confess that faith you have and be buried in the waters of baptism, because that's what the Scriptures say, and you want to obey, because then you can be justified by your faith. Maybe you're here and you've done that and you say, somewhere along the line I've not lived as I should. I've not lived the kind of somewhere along the line I've not lived as I should. I've not lived had the kind of obedient faith or reverence or any of the other things we talked about this morning that I need to. If you're here and if it's of a private nature, take it to the Lord privately in prayer. But if it is of a public nature or you desire the prayers of the congregation, then we will gladly pray with you and for you for God to forgive you. But no matter what your need is, we can just